Chapter 7. New Acquaintances. Petrov. But time passed, and little by little I got used to it. Every day I was less and less bewildered by the daily events of my new life. My eyes grew, as it were, accustomed to incidents, surroundings, men. To be reconciled to this life was impossible, but it was high time to accept it as an accomplished fact. Any perplexities that still remained in my mind I concealed within myself as completely as possible. I no longer wandered about the prison like one distraught, and no longer showed my misery. The savagely inquisitive eyes of the convicts were not so often fixed on me. They did not watch me with such an assumption of insolence. They had grown used to me too, apparently, and I was very glad of it. I walked about prison as though I were at home, knew my place on the common bed, and seemed to have grown used to things which I should have thought I could never in my life have grown used to. Regularly, once a week, I went to have half my head shaved. Every Saturday in our free time we were called out in turn from the prison to the guardhouse. If we did not go, we had to get shaved on our own account. And there the barbers of the battalion rubbed our heads with cold lather and mercilessly scraped them with blunt razors. It makes me shiver even now when I recall that torture. But the remedy was soon found. Akim Akimych pointed out to me a convict in the military division who, for a kopeck, would shave with his own razor anyone who liked. That was his trade. Many of the convicts went to him to escape the prison barbers, though they were by no means a sensitive lot. Our convict barber was called the Major. Why, I don't know, and in what way he suggested the Major, I can't say. As I write, I recall this Major, a tall, lean, taciturn fellow, rather stupid, always absorbed in his occupation, never without a strop on which he was day and night sharpening his incredibly worn-out razor. He was apparently concentrated on this pursuit, which he evidently looked upon as his vocation in life. He was really extremely happy when the razor was in good condition and someone came to be shaved. His lather was warm, his hand was light, the shaving was like velvet. He evidently enjoyed his art and was proud of it, and he carelessly took the kopeck he had earned as though he did the work for art's sake and not for profit. A caught it on one occasion from our Major when, telling him tales about the prisoners, he incautiously spoke of our barber as the Major. The real Major flew into a rage and was extremely offended. "Do you know, you rascal, what is meant by a major?" he shouted, foaming at the mouth and falling upon A in his usual fashion. "Do you understand what is meant by a major? And here you dare to call a scoundrelly convict major before me in my presence!" No one but A could have got on with such a man. From the very first day of my life in prison, I began to dream of freedom. To calculate in 1,000 different ways when my days in prison would be over became my favorite occupation. It was always in my mind, and I am sure that it is the same with everyone who is deprived of freedom for a fixed period. I don't know whether the other convicts thought and calculated as I did, but the amazing audacity of their hopes impressed me from the beginning. The hopes of a prisoner deprived of freedom are utterly different from those of a man living a natural life. A free man hopes, of course, for a change of luck, for instance, or the success of an undertaking. But he lives, he acts, he is caught up in the world of life. It is very different with the prisoner. There is life for him, too, granted, prison life. But whatever the convict may be, and whatever may be the term of his sentence, he is instinctively unable to accept his lot as something positive, final, as part of real life. Every convict feels that he is, so to speak, not at home, but on a visit. He looks at 20 years as though they were 2, and is fully convinced that when he leaves prison at 55, he will be as full of life and energy as he is now at 35. "I've still life before me," he thinks, and resolutely drives away all doubts and other vexatious ideas. Even those in the special division who had been sentenced for life sometimes reckoned on orders suddenly coming from Petersburg, to send them to the mines at Nerchinsk and to limit their sentence. Then it would be all right. To begin with, it is almost 6 months' journey to Nerchinsk, and how much pleasanter the journey would be than being in prison. And afterwards the term in Nerchinsk would be over, and then... And sometimes even gray-headed men reckoned like this. At Tobolsk I have seen convicts chained to the wall. The man is kept on a chain 7 feet long. He has a bedstead by him. He is chained like this for some exceptionally terrible crime committed in Siberia. They are kept like that for 5 years, for 10 years. They are generally brigands. I only saw one among them who looked as if he had belonged to the upper classes. He had been in the government service somewhere. He spoke submissively with a lisp. His smile was mawkishly sweet. He showed us his chain, showed how he could most comfortably lie on the bed. He must have been a choice specimen. As a rule, they all behave quietly and seem contented, yet every one of them is intensely anxious for the end of his sentence. Why, one wonders? I will tell you why. He will get out of the stifling, dank room with its low vaulted roof of brick, and will walk in the prison yard, and that is all. He will never be allowed out of the prison. He knows those who have been in chains are always kept in prison and fettered to the day of their death. He knows that, and yet he is desperately eager for the end of his time on the chain. But for that longing, how could he remain 5 or 6 years on the chain without dying or going out of his mind? Some of them would not endure it at all. I felt that work might be the saving of me, might strengthen my physical frame and my health. Continual mental anxiety, nervous irritation, the foul air of the prison might well be my destruction. Being constantly in the open air, working every day till I was tired, learning to carry heavy weights. At any rate, I shall save myself, I thought. I shall make myself strong. I shall leave the prison healthy, vigorous, hearty, and not old. I was not mistaken. The work and exercise were very good for me. I looked with horror at one of my companions, a man of my own class. He was wasting like a candle in prison. He entered it at the same time as I did, young, handsome, and vigorous, and he left it half-shattered, gray-headed, gasping for breath and unable to walk. No, I thought, looking at him, I want to live and will live. But at first I got into hot water among the convicts for my fondness for work, and for a long time they assailed me with gibes and contempt. But I took no notice of anyone and set off cheerfully, for instance, to the baking and pounding of alabaster, one of the first things I learnt to do. That was easy work. The officials who supervised our work were ready, as far as possible, to be lenient in allotting work to prisoners belonging to the upper classes, which was by no means an undue indulgence, but simple justice. It would be strange to expect from a man of half the strength and no experience of manual labor the same amount of work as the ordinary workman had by regulation to get through. But this indulgence was not always shown, and it was, as it were, surreptitious. A strict watch was kept from outside to check it. Very often we had to go to heavy work, and then, of course, it was twice as hard for the upper-class convicts as for the rest. 3 or 4 men were usually sent to the Alabaster, old or weak by preference, and we, of course, came under that heading. But besides these, a real workman who understood the work was always told off for the job. The same workman went regularly for some years to this task, a dark, lean, oldish man called Almazov, grim, unsociable, and peevish. He had a profound contempt for us, but he was so taciturn that he was even lazy about grumbling at us. The shed in which the alabaster was baked and pounded stood also on the steep, desolate river bank. In winter, especially in dull weather, it was dreary to look over the river and at the faraway bank on the other side. There was something poignant and heart-rending in this wild, desolate landscape. But it was almost more painful when the sun shone brightly on the immense white expanse of snow. One longed to fly away into that expanse which stretched from the other side of the river, an untrodden plain for 1,200 miles to the south. Almazov usually set to work in grim silence. We were ashamed, as it were, that we could not be any real help to him, and he managed alone and asked no help from us on purpose, it seemed, to make us conscious of our shortcomings and remorseful for our uselessness. And yet all he had to do was to heat the oven for baking in it the alabaster, which we used to fetch for him. Next day, when the alabaster was thoroughly baked, the task of unloading it from the oven began. Each of us took a heavy mallet, filled himself a special box of alabaster, and set to work to pound it. This was delightful work. The brittle alabaster was quickly transformed to white shining powder. It crumbled so well and so easily. We swung our heavy mallets and made such a din that we enjoyed it ourselves. We were tired at the end, and at the same time we felt better. Our cheeks were flushed, our blood circulated more quickly. At this point, even Almazov began to look at us with indulgence, as people look at small children. He smoked his pipe condescendingly, though he could not help grumbling when he had to speak. But he was like that with everyone, though I believe he was a good-natured man at bottom. Another task to which I was sent was to turn the lathe in the workshop. It was a big, heavy wheel. It needed a good deal of effort to move it, especially when the turner, one of the regimental workmen, was shaping some piece of furniture for the use of an official, such as a banister or a big table leg for which a big log was required. In such cases it was beyond one man's strength to turn the wheel, and generally 2 of us were sent, myself and another gentleman whom I will call B. For several years, whenever anything had to be turned, this task fell to our share. B was a frail, weakly young fellow who suffered with his lungs. He had entered the prison a year before my arrival, together with 2 others, his comrades. One, an old man who spent all his time, day and night, saying his prayers, for which he was greatly respected by the convicts, and died before I left prison. And the other, quite a young lad, fresh, rosy, strong, and full of spirit, who had carried B for more than 500 miles on the journey when the latter was too exhausted to walk. The affection between them was worth seeing. B was a man of very good education, generous feelings, and a lofty character, which had been embittered and made irritable by illness. We used to manage the wheel together, and the work interested us both. It was first-rate exercise for me. I was particularly fond, too, of shoveling away the snow. This had to be done as a rule after snowstorms, which were pretty frequent in winter. After a snowstorm lasting 24 hours, some houses would be snowed up to the middle of the windows, and others would be almost buried. Then, as soon as the storm was over and the sun came out, we were driven out in big gangs, sometimes the whole lot of us, to shovel away the snowdrifts from the government buildings. Everyone was given a spade. A task was set for all together, and sometimes such a task that it was a wonder they could get through it, and all set to work with a will. The soft new snow, a little frozen at the top, was easily lifted in huge spadefuls and was scattered about, turning to fine glistening powder in the air. The spade cut readily into the white mass sparkling in the sunshine. The convicts were almost always merry over this job. The fresh winter air and the exercise warmed them up. Everyone grew more cheerful. There were sounds of laughter, shouts, jests. They began snowballing each other, not without protest, of course, from the serious ones, who were indignant at the laughter and merriment, and the general excitement usually ended in swearing. Little by little I began to enlarge my circle of acquaintance. Though, indeed, I did not think of making acquaintances myself. I was still restless, gloomy, and mistrustful. My acquaintanceships arose of themselves. One of the first to visit me was a convict called Petrov. I say visit me, and I lay special emphasis on the word. Petrov was in the special division, and lived in the part of the prison furthest from me. There could apparently be no connection between us, and we certainly had and could have nothing in common. And yet in those early days Petrov seemed to feel it his duty to come to our room to see me almost every day, or to stop me when I was walking in our leisure hour behind the prison as much out of sight as I could. At first I disliked this, but he somehow succeeded in making his visits a positive diversion to me, though he was by no means a particularly sociable or talkative man. He was a short, strongly built man, agile and restless, pale with high cheekbones and fearless eyes, with a rather pleasant face, fine white close-set teeth, and an everlasting plug of tobacco between them and his lower lip. This habit of holding tobacco in the mouth was common among the convicts. He seemed younger than his age. He was 40 and looked no more than 30. He always talked to me without a trace of constraint, and treated me exactly as his equal, that is, behaved with perfect good breeding and delicacy. If he noticed, for instance, that I was anxious to be alone, he would leave me in 2 or 3 minutes after a few words of conversation, and he always thanked me for attending to him, a courtesy which he never showed, of course, to anyone else in prison. It is curious that such relations continued between us for several years, and never became more intimate, though he really was attached to me. I cannot to this day make up my mind what he wanted of me, why he came to me every day. Though he did happen to steal from me later on, he stole, as it were, by accident. He scarcely ever asked me for money, so he did not come for the sake of money or with any interested motive. I don't know why, but I always felt as though he were not living in prison with me, but somewhere far away in another house in the town, and that he only visited the prison in passing, to hear the news, to see me, to see how we were all getting on. He was always in a hurry, as though he had left someone waiting for him, or some job unfinished. And yet he did not seem flustered. The look in his eyes, too, was rather strange, intent with a shade of boldness and mockery. Yet he looked, as it were, into the distance, as though beyond the things that met his eyes he were trying to make out something else far away. This gave him an absent-minded look. I sometimes purposely watched where Petrov went when he left me. Where was someone waiting for him? But he would hurry away from me to a prison ward or a kitchen, would sit down there beside some convicts, listen attentively to their conversation, and sometimes take part in it himself, even speaking with heat. Then he would suddenly break off and relapse into silence. But whether he were talking or sitting silent, it always appeared that he did so for a moment in passing, that he had something else to do and was expected elsewhere. The strangest thing was that he never had anything to do. He led a life of absolute leisure, except for the regulation work, of course. He knew no sort of trade, and he scarcely ever had any money. But he did not grieve much over the lack of it. And what did he talk to me about? His conversation was as strange as himself. He would see, for instance, that I was walking alone behind the prison, and would turn abruptly in my direction. He always walked quickly and turned abruptly. He walked up, yet it seemed he must have been running.
"Good morning."
"Good morning."
"I am not interrupting you."
"No."
"I wanted to ask you about Napoleon. He is a relation of the one who was here in 1812, isn't he?"
Petrov was a Cantonist and could read and write. "Yes."
"He is some sort of president, they say, isn't he?"
He always asked rapid, abrupt questions, as though he were in a hurry to learn something. It seemed as though he were investigating some matter of great importance which would not admit of any delay. I explained how he was a president, and added that he might soon be an emperor.
"How is that?"
I explained that, too, as far as I could. Petrov listened attentively, understanding perfectly and reflecting rapidly, even turning his ear towards me.
I wanted to ask you, Alexander Petrovitch, is it true, as they say, that there are monkeys with arms down to their heels and as big as a tall man?"
"Yes, there are."
"What are they like?"
That, too, I explained as far as I was able.
"And where do they live?"
"In hot countries. There are some in the island of Sumatra."
"That's in America, isn't it? Don't they say that the people in those parts walk on their heads?"
"Not on their heads. You mean the Antipodes." I explained what America was like and what was meant by the Antipodes. He listened as attentively as though he had come simply to hear about the Antipodes.
Last year I read about the Countess La Valliere. Arefeev got the book from the adjutants. Is it true, or is it just invented? It's written by Dumas."
"It's invented, of course."
"Well, goodbye. Thank you."
And Petrov vanished, and we rarely talked except in this style. I began inquiring about him. M. positively warned me when he heard of the acquaintance. He told me that many of the convicts had inspired him with horror, especially at first, in his early days in prison. But not one of them, not even Gazin, had made such a terrible impression on him as this Petrov. "He is the most determined, the most fearless of all the convicts," said M. "He is capable of anything. He would stick at nothing if the fancy took him. He would murder you if it happened to strike him. He would murder you in a minute without flinching or giving it a thought afterwards. I believe he is not quite in his right mind." This view interested me very much. But M. could give me no reason for thinking so. And strange to say, I knew Petrov for several years afterwards and talked to him almost every day. He was genuinely attached to me all that time, though I am absolutely unable to say why. And all those years he behaved well in prison and did nothing horrible. Yet every time I looked at him and talked to him, I felt sure that M. was right, and that Petrov really was a most determined and fearless man who recognized no restraint of any sort. Why I felt this I can't explain either. I may mention, however, that this Petrov was the convict who had intended, on being let out to be flogged, to murder the major, when the latter was saved only by a miracle, as the convict said, through driving away just before. It had happened once, before he came to prison, that he had been struck by the colonel at drill. Probably he had been struck many times before, but this time he could not put up with it, and he stabbed his colonel openly in broad daylight in the face of the regiment. But I don't know all the details of this story. He never told it me. No doubt these were only outbursts when the man's character showed itself fully all at once. But they were very rare in him. He really was sensible and even peaceable. Passions were latent in him, and hot, violent passions too, but the burning embers were always covered with a layer of ashes and smoldered quietly. I never saw the faintest trace of vanity or boastfulness in him, as in others. He rarely quarreled. On the other hand, he was not particularly friendly with anyone, except perhaps with Sirotkin, and then only when the latter was of use to him. Once, however, I saw him seriously angry. Something was not given him, something which was properly his share. A convict in the civilian division called Vasily Antonov was quarreling with him. He was a tall, powerful athlete, spiteful, quarrelsome, malicious, and very far from being a coward. They had been shouting at each other for a long time, and I thought that the matter would at most end in a blow or two, for at times, though rarely, Petrov swore and fought like the meanest convict. But this time it was not so. Petrov suddenly blanched. His lips suddenly quivered and turned blue. He began breathing hard. He got up from his place and slowly, very slowly, with his bare, noiseless steps — in summer he was very fond of going barefoot — he approached Antonov. There was a sudden silence in the noisy, shouting crowd. One could have heard a fly. Everyone waited to see what would happen. Antonov leapt up as he approached, looking aghast. I could not bear the sight of it and left the room. I expected to hear the shriek of a murdered man before I had time to get down the steps. But this time, too, it ended in nothing. Before Petrov had time to reach him, Antonov hastily and in silence flung him the object about which they were disputing, which was some old rag they used to put round their legs. Of course, 2 or 3 minutes later, Antonov swore at him a little to satisfy his conscience and keep up appearances by showing that he was not quite cowed. But Petrov took no notice of his abuse, did not even answer it. It was not a question of abuse. The point had been won in his favor. He was very well pleased and took his rag. A quarter of an hour later, he was sauntering about the prison as usual, with an air of complete unconcern, and seemed to be looking round to find people talking about something interesting, that he might poke his nose in and listen. Everything seemed to interest him, yet it somehow happened that he remained indifferent to most things and simply wandered aimlessly about the prison, drawn first one way and then another. One might have compared him with a workman, a stalwart workman who could send the work flying, but was for a while without a job, and meantime sat playing with little children. I could not understand either why he remained in prison, why he did not run away. He would not have hesitated to run away if he had felt any strong inclination to do so. Men like Petrov are only ruled by reason till they have some strong desire. Then there is no obstacle on earth that can hinder them. And I am sure he would have escaped cleverly, that he would have outwitted everyone, that he could have stayed for a week without bread, somewhere in the forest or in the reeds of the river. But he evidently had not reached that point yet, and did not fully desire it. I never noticed in him any great power of reflection or any marked common sense. These people are born with one fixed idea which unconsciously moves them hither and thither. So they shift from one thing to another all their lives, till they find a work after their own hearts. Then they are ready to risk anything. I wondered sometimes how it was that a man who had murdered his officer for a blow could lie down under a flogging with such resignation. He was sometimes flogged when he was caught smuggling in vodka. Like all convicts without a trade, he sometimes undertook to bring in vodka. But he lay down to be flogged, as it were with his own consent, that is, as though acknowledging that he deserved it. Except for that, nothing would have induced him to lie down. He would have been killed first. I wondered at him, too, when he stole from me in spite of his unmistakable devotion. This seemed to come upon him, as it were, in streaks. It was he who stole my Bible when I asked him to carry it from one place to another. He had only a few steps to go, but he succeeded in finding a purchaser on the way, sold it, and spent the proceeds on drink. Evidently he wanted very much to drink, and anything that he wanted very much he had to do. That is the sort of man who will murder a man for 6 pence to get a bottle of vodka, though another time he would let a man pass with £10,000 on him. In the evening he told me of the theft himself without the slightest embarrassment or regret, quite indifferently, as though it were the most ordinary incident. I tried to give him a good scolding. Besides, I was sorry to lose my Bible. He listened without irritation, very meekly in fact, agreed that the Bible was a very useful book, sincerely regretted that I no longer possessed it, but expressed no regret at having stolen it. He looked at me with such complacency that I at once gave up scolding him. He accepted my scolding, probably reflecting that it was inevitable that one should be sworn at for such doings, and better I should relieve my feelings and console myself by swearing, but that it was all really nonsense, such nonsense that a serious person would be ashamed to talk about it. It seemed to me that he looked upon me as a sort of child, almost a baby, who did not understand the simplest things in the world. If I began, for instance, on any subject not a learned or bookish one, he would answer me indeed, but apparently only from politeness, confining himself to the briefest reply. I often wondered what the book knowledge about which he usually questioned me meant to him. I sometimes happened to look sideways at him during our conversations to see whether he were laughing at me. But no, usually he was listening seriously and even with some attention, though often so little that I felt annoyed. He asked exact and definite questions, but showed no great surprise at the information he got from me, and received it indeed rather absent-mindedly. I fancied, too, that he had made up his mind once for all, without bothering his head about it, that it was no use talking to me as one would to other people, that apart from talking of books I understood nothing and was incapable of understanding anything, so there was no need to worry me. I am sure that he had a real affection for me, and that struck me very much. Whether he considered me undeveloped, not fully a man, or felt for me that special sort of compassion that every strong creature instinctively feels for someone weaker, recognizing me as such, I don't know. And although all that did not prevent him from robbing me, I am sure he felt sorry for me as he did it. He may have thought as he laid hands on my property. What a man! He can't even defend his own property. But I fancy that was what he liked me for. He said to me himself one day, as it were casually, that I was a man with too good a heart, and so simple that it makes one feel sorry for you. Only don't take it amiss, Alexander Petrovitch, he added a minute later. I spoke without thinking, from my heart. It sometimes happens that such people come conspicuously to the front and take a prominent position at the moment of some violent mass movement or revolution, and in that way achieve all at once their full possibilities. They are not men of words and cannot be the instigators or the chief leaders of a movement, but they are its most vigorous agents and the first to act. They begin simply, with no special flourish, but they are the first to surmount the worst obstacles, facing every danger without reflection, without fear, and all rush after, blindly following them to the last wall, where they often lay down their lives. I do not believe that Petrov has come to a good end. He would make short work of everything all at once, and, if he has not perished yet, it is simply that the moment has not come. Who knows, though? Maybe he will live till his hair is gray and will die peaceably of old age, wandering aimlessly to and fro. But I believe M. was right when he said that Petrov was the most determined man in all the prison. Breaking in. In this chapter, Dostoevsky is papering over the effect of prison upon his physical welfare. While, as he states here, the manual labor may have done him good, and prevented him from withering away like Durov, prison life did no favors to his overall health. The most significant effect was the exacerbation of his nervous condition, and his post-Siberian life would be plagued by severe epileptic fits. We will see in later chapters that he spends a disproportionate amount of time in the prison hospital. The frail and sickly B, to whom we are briefly introduced here, is a Polish political prisoner. We'll get to know more about this group later. The desultory flurry of questions Petrov shoots at Goryanchikov in that brief snatch of dialogue reveals that Petrov has greater than average exposure to intellectual topics, but is beset with the most elementary of misconceptions. He confuses America with the Antipodes, that is, the region including Australia and New Zealand, and assumes that, since people there are in the southern hemisphere, they must walk on their heads. Louis de Vallière is part of a sequence of novels by Dumas, which begins with The Three Musketeers and ends with The Man in the Iron Mask. Petrov can read it, but is unable to recognize it as fiction. The Napoleon Petrov refers to is Napoleon III, the nephew of the great general who was beaten back by the Russians in 1812. He was elected president of France in 1848, but declared himself emperor in 1852. So we can take a guess as to roughly when this conversation took place. End of comments.